It's just fascinating because the more you read about Singapore, the more you sort of go, oh, wow, that's actually a smart way of doing things. Right. And I would really wish that, many of our politicians in the West were to maybe have a look at how Singapore does things.
All right, everybody, welcome to another Borderless podcast. And today I have on Gregor Gregersen, who is the CEO of silverbullion.com.sg. And he is a precious metals vault business in Singapore. We got to talk a lot about Singapore itself as a jurisdiction, as a place to live, why he chose to become a citizen of Singapore and give back his German citizenship. While I was speaking to him, he was in Tuscany, so that was very nice. He has a Singapore citizenship, which is he tells about all the advantages of that while he's enjoying the beautiful Tuscany life there. So that's a great way to have your life set up. And we also talked about the market for gold and silver, the market for precious metals in conjunction with Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies, and the innovative things that he's doing with his company, like a original P2P lending platform where you can borrow money with very low interest rates or lend money to people in an almost risk-free manner. So it's a very interesting conversation. I think that there's a lot of information here that you're going to enjoy. So here we go.
Welcome to the Borderless Podcast, your guide to traveling, investing, and living beyond borders, where we talk about living the life that you want to live, where you want to live it.
All right, everybody. Today on the line, I have with me Gregor Gregersen, and we're going to talk all about his company, which is Bullion.com.sg. But first, Gregor, if you don't mind, can you give us a little bit of background about you and what brought you to where you are today?
Well, my background is software engineering originally and finance. So by 2008, I was a senior data architect for Commerzbank, second biggest bank in Germany. And I was pretty much sitting in the trading room when Lehman Brothers went bankrupt. And so I had a first-hand view of a financial system almost going down the drain. And once that happened, a lot of people ended up going and buying physical precious metals. And I was sort of standing there scratching my head and kind of saying, yeah, counterparty risk, actually, that's a really important thing when things seem to be going badly. And by the time I went to buy some bullion in Germany back at the time in Frankfurt, it was almost impossible to get any because the physical was all bought up. So I realized that the causes which caused, say 2008 near crash are still there, have been getting worse, and we're going to have a much bigger crisis in the future.
Right.
And when that happens, I thought it would make a lot of sense to have physical gold, physical silver, and have it in a jurisdiction which I can feel confident about that it's going to be a safe jurisdiction. Because, as you know, in the past, we had nationalizations in the United States. We had similar quasi-nationalizations in England and other parts of the world. So having your gold in a very heavily indebted country doesn't seem that safe in today's environment. And that's basically how I said, okay, I want to try and figure out a way to get silver and gold stored as safely as possible in Singapore.
Right. And as you see it, why did you choose Singapore, and what differentiates Singapore from some of the other countries or jurisdictions that you mentioned?
Okay. Well, I'm a very international person. I've lived about 11 years in Italy, about 8 years in Germany, 12 years in the United States, and about 9 years in Singapore now. And basically, Singapore has an amazing government. That's sort of what the gist of it is. It's the only government I've found which really seems to be doing what's best for the people for the long term. And they're very, very smart about it. And ultimately, the government, Singapore, they don't have any natural resources. They're basically saying we have to provide a good service. We have to find our place in the world. And we have to win the confidence of investors and foreign people coming there. And that was basically the success formula of Singapore, being as good as you can be in just about everything and always stick with your word. So little tiny Singapore back in 1965 was basically a third world country. And nowadays it has the second highest per capita income in the world. Little tiny Singapore is also the biggest foreign investor in China, which is quite amazing for such a small country. And interestingly enough, it's basically a city-state with 700 square kilometers, and yet they have armed forces of about 950,000 people, which can be called in. So in many ways, they're sort of the Switzerland of Asia. And they're also very careful to be neutral in all matters. Singapore does not ally itself as any one country, because as soon as you ally yourself, you make enemies somewhere else. So they have a very prudent foreign policy. They have a big military to basically be able to defend themselves, and they're very, very rich, and they're very well trusted. Mm-hmm. So if you put all of these things together, it's probably one of the best places to put your gold, because of that trust factor, and because they will be the last ones to ever nationalize gold, because if they would, they will basically be committing economic suicide. And they have plenty of money, so they wouldn't need to do that.
Yeah, right. I noticed in another interview that you mentioned a book, and I actually put it on my Amazon list. I'm planning on getting it, but if people want to get a little bit more into the specifics, you recommended a book. What was the name of that book about Singapore?
Yes, it's called From Third World to First World. Mm-hmm. And it was written by Lee Kuan Yew, who was the Prime Minister of Singapore from 65 until 89. So this guy basically built modern Singapore. And in this book, he describes very, very matter-of-factly how the laws in Singapore were made, why they were made this way, how the retirement system works, how the different ministries are organized, how to create competition between ministries so that you don't end up with non-functioning or sub-performing governance. And I basically read almost half of the book in one go, and because I was so fascinated by it. And by the time I reached also my flight back from Singapore to Europe, by the time I arrived in Europe, I said I'm going to move to Singapore because I just thought, wow, here's a government which actually knows what they're doing. And that book basically sold me on Singapore. So okay. I very highly recommend it for people who would like to know more about Singapore.
Okay. And, we'll definitely get into the precious metal stuff. But let's talk about Singapore a little bit more, too. So I assume that you spend a lot of your time there. Is that correct?
Yes, actually, I've become a citizen now.
Okay. Oh, great. So can you explain kind of life in general there? I mean, maybe a lot of people have the impression that it's, authoritarian or something like that. How do you? What are some other objections that people say about Singapore? I mean, how do you find life there?
There's a lot of misconceptions about Singapore. What people normally quote is you're going to be thrown into prison if you chew chewing gum. that's the typical right. You hear. The reality is very different. You have to understand Singapore used to be a third world country. So when the government, people ended up going into flats for the first time, there were people who brought chickens along in the flats, who brought pigs into the flats, and so on. So when you see a sign in Singapore which says that you should not be peeing in the elevator. Right. That sign is not there because they want to prohibit everything, but because indeed they had some people which were peeing in the elevator. So that's just a piece of background, because Singapore just became so rich and such a industrialized and basically grew in wealth so quickly that some of the older folks, they sort of are being left with some very old ways of doing things, including peeing in the elevator. Right. So when it comes to the chewing gum, the problem was that people started putting these on the MRT trains and basically blocking the sensors. And it became such a nuisance that the government just said, okay, we're going to prohibit not chewing gum, but selling gum in Singapore. So that's all it is. You can bring your own gum, you can chew it, nobody cares. They're not selling it in stores, basically. Now, having said all of this, there actually are not many laws in Singapore. And people always think there's a ton of laws. There aren't. I mean, the tax system is fantastic. I'm used to the American tax system. I'm used to the German tax system. And I'm used to the Italian one. And one is worse than the other. The Singaporean one, you know, this year I'm probably paying 4% taxes. And my tax return literally takes me 5 minutes to do. It's all online.
Yeah.
It's the first time I did it, you know, I spent 5 to 6 minutes filling out this form and 15 minutes trying to figure out if that's really all I need to do because it was so simple.
Yeah. Wow. That's, can you go into, I mean, you know, not getting too explicit and all that stuff, but maybe some of the details about the tax rates and stuff like that and how it's calculated, how it's different than what we might be used to?
Yeah. Some of the biggest differences, I would say, is the government tries to encourage people to work. So to start off, what they're saying, it's my job as a government to make sure that you have a good education. And Singapore spends a lot of money on education. They tend to be first, second, or third place, you know, international competition all the time. It's my job as a government to make sure I'm creating the conditions for businesses to create jobs. And the unemployment level of Singapore is around 2%, so there are plenty of jobs. But it's your job as a citizen or a person to actually find a job. And there's no unemployment help if you don't get your job. Now, when it comes, so that's like a basic. So there's not a lot of welfare. So the government says, first you will have to go back to the family. Now, in extreme cases, they will provide some welfare, but the idea is we find you some sort of job to do. Now, if you're a beggar on the street, what the government does is you get free tissue paper. And you can sell the tissue paper to people at food stores and so on. And the food stores don't sell tissue paper. So, you know, now you take a person who's basically on the street and you just made a little entrepreneur by giving him free tissue paper and the guy earns a little bit of money. That's how Singaporeans think. You know, you give people a fishing pole, not a fish.
Yeah.
Now, from the pension system, and this is very important because pension is such a huge time bomb for us in Europe and in the US. From the pension system, it's a self-funding system, meaning when you work at a job and say you're earning $100,000, your tax rate probably is around 5%. That's all you're paying. But 20% has to go into this retirement fund. Now, your employer is contributing 16%. So that means 36% of your gross income goes into this fund. Now, this fund is your money. You can use that money to help you do a down payment on a house. You can use that money to pay your mortgage. If you have kids, you can use the money to help pay for college, but they will have to pay it back later on. If you leave Singapore, the government pays out that money to you. If you come back to Singapore, you have to put it back in. So the government basically is just trying to get you to save that money, but it's truly your money. It's not a common tub where the money is spent to pay somebody else's welfare or retirement set. So they sort of managed to take care of the retirement problem.
And that money is not taxed?
Oh, no, it's not taxed.
Okay, so it just sits in a government fund or something?
You can choose to some degree where you want to put it.
Okay.
The first up to 50,000, the government guarantees 5% return, and it's going into the big sovereign wealth funds that Singapore has, GIC and Temasek. These are some of the biggest wealth funds in the world, with around, I think combined they have around $600 or $700 billion. But then, but once you go above your 50,000 base money, you can choose to some degree where you put the money. And most people really use that money to pay for their mortgages and basically invest in their house.
Okay. Yeah. Now, what about pricing? The cost of living in Singapore. I've heard that it's pretty expensive there.
Well, it depends where you go. One thing to keep in mind is that in Singapore, your income tax is very low. There is no tax on interest, there's no capital gain tax, and there's no tax on dividends. So If you have a business here, basically you pay very, very little tax. Now, when it comes to cost of living, what's expensive is housing. If you buy your own condo and so on, oftentimes you have to look at, in US dollar terms, at least $500,000 or more. Cars are extremely expensive. And the reason is that Singapore is basically limiting the number of cars on the island to 450,000 cars. And if you want to buy a car, you have to get a driving permit. And the driving permit is issued every month around 20 or 30,000. And there's a bidding system. It's basically traded almost like a stock. And it goes up and down in value. So if you want to drive a car, and for 10 years in Singapore, when I first came to Singapore, you had to pay $9,000 to get this permit. And then 4 years ago, it went up to, in Singapore dollar terms, to almost 90,000 Singapore dollars. So that's around 60,000 US dollars just to have a permit to drive a car. And that's basically supply and demand driven. Now, that money goes to the government. The government uses that money to pay for road construction, tram construction, train construction, all these other things. So the money doesn't have to come from income tax from people. You see, they basically believe in taxing at the source, as opposed to taxing income of people. And having said that, even though taxes are so low, Singapore has had budget surpluses 23 times out of the last 25 years. So it's just fascinating, because the more you read about Singapore, the more you sort of go, oh, wow, that's actually a smart way of doing things. Right. And I would really wish that, many of our politicians in the West were to maybe have a look at how Singapore does things and copy some of these concepts. But most people don't realize Singapore is a full republic. And it's just that the people have been re-electing the same government year after year after year. But it's incredibly close to the people. And I'll give you an example. I live in an area called Ang Mo Kio now in Singapore, which is like middle north area of Singapore. And twice per month, on Wednesdays between 7 to 9, I can meet with the minister, which is responsible for my area, and I can complain to him to just about everything that's on my mind. I can tell him, look, I applied for the passport. It took me 7 days to get my passport. That's way too long. I needed to have it quicker. And the minister truly is going to take a note of it and kind of say, okay, let me see if we can improve on that.
That's interesting.
And that's why everything works so well. And Singaporeans, even though they pay so little taxes, they complain all the time.
Right.
So it's really not that Singapore has a totalitarian sort of dictator-like system. It's portrayed like that in the press a lot, but on the ground, you will find that you have an extremely responsive government. And not in the last election, but the election before, people were getting upset that there were too many foreigners coming, that home prices were getting too unaffordable, and the trains were becoming too crowded. And so many of them elected for elected the opposition. And the government got really scared, because they always used to have 75, 80% votes, and suddenly they dropped by 7 or 8 percentage points. And based on that, they ended up spending a lot more on trams, reducing immigration to some degree, and so on and so on. So it is a republic. It's just a very, very well-run republic. And a lot of people vote for the government because they've done such a good job.
And I guess it's also got, it's not like a giant nation state, right? I mean, it's a smaller area, has a smaller population, that it would be easier to, have a more efficient type of government, I suppose. Also, a pretty smart population.
You started off with a lot of problems. Having a small state is good in some ways. So, for example, internet connection is fantastic. We get 1 gigabyte fiber connections everywhere for $20 per month in Singapore. But then for some things, it's very bad to be a small nation. If you want to have a large military and you're a city-state, so it's very difficult to have an efficient military. So Singapore has to have military bases all over the place in order to defend itself well. But what Singapore again did really well is plan long term. So in '65, Singapore basically had 3 different ethnic groups. About 70% are ethnic Chinese. Malaysians are about 16% or so. Indians tend to be 8 to 9%, and the rest are various foreigners, Europeans, and so on. So you've got 4 languages. So official language is English. Then you got Malay, you got Tamil, and you got Mandarin Chinese. And you got 6 different religions. Now you can imagine having all these different ethnic groups in a small space. If you're not smart about making sure that these people can coexist, you're basically going to have riots and civil war and so on and so on. And Singapore basically managed to have all these different races coexist together through a number of smart ways. And I give you one example. In Singapore is one of the highest homeowner rates in the world, around 92%. And even so, homes are very, very expensive. And the way the government managed to achieve that is that when you're a young couple and you want to buy a home, the government basically gives you a subsidy of 50 to 60%, and the down payment can be paid with the retirement funds. So by doing this, the government basically encourages home ownership. But they said that if you want to have the free money, then if you're an Indian, you're going to have to move into a Chinese area. If you're Chinese, you're going to have to move in a Malay area. If you're Malay, you have to go and move in an Indian area. And by doing it, they basically mixed up the population, and they prevented the ghetto thing forming, or the me versus them sort of thing. So Singaporeans are looking at themselves as being Singaporeans first, and then Malay or something else. And your neighbor might be Indian, and because it's your neighbor, you suddenly get much more used to living next to an Indian. And that's just one example where over 20, 30 years, it created a much tighter integration.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, it sounds like a great option for people that might be looking for somewhere else to live and start a life, be successful. Sounds like you would recommend it. How would somebody go about doing that? They just go and try to find a job online or something like that?
So the way I did it is I basically just moved. I quit my job in Germany. I moved to Singapore. Then my company in Germany said, "Hey, can you work from us from Germany? I mean, from Singapore." And I said yes, and I quadrupled my pay just because I was getting paid the same amount of money, but I didn't have to pay German taxes anymore.
Oh wow, yeah.
And I managed to work there because I earned more than I believe it was 5,000 Singapore dollars, which was say around $4,000 per month.
Okay.
If you earn more than that in your current job, then you used to be able to get a PAP, which is a personalized employment pass in Singapore, which allowed you to basically work freely in Singapore. So it was very easy to move there. I eventually ended up getting a job at Commerzbank in Singapore in order to get my PR, which basically is my green card. Now, it was easier to do that back in 2008, 2009. 2007. Right now, it's because so many people have come to Singapore, they're much more selective. And if you have the right skills, if you are in IT security, for example, cyber warfare, if you're in biochemical research, if you're in gene splicing, if you are in any of these things which, these skills which are in high demand, you get a visa right away without problems. If you're in some sort of job category where there's not that much demand, then it's a bit more difficult.
Okay, and once you do get a visa permit and you're there for a while, you said that you are now a citizen, or you're becoming a citizen?
I am a citizen.
You're a citizen now. Okay, so what was that process like? How quickly did that take?
Well, I've become a PR. The harder part is to become a PR. A PR is sort of like a green card, permanent resident. And once you're a PR, you can basically live indefinitely, you can work anywhere, and you can do just about everything besides voting. I got my PR in 2008. And once you are a PR, you can apply for citizenship within 3 years or so. Now, I waited until 2017. I just got my citizenship. Because if you get a Singapore citizenship, you have to give up your other citizenships. So I decided to give up my German citizenship in order to get the Singapore passport.
I see. So you're only a Singapore citizen now. I mean, and you know, the European passport is pretty nice, right? I mean, you're able to travel and do business all throughout Europe, but you've still found that the Singapore citizenship was worth it.
Yes, from a travel perspective, the Singapore passport is actually better than a German one because it's the only passport which allows you to go into China, India, Europe, and the US without a visa.
Okay.
So the biggest downside for me was that I lost my opportunity to easily work in Europe. But given the amount of taxes and the hassle, I really didn't foresee myself ever wanting to work in Europe again.
Right.
But
you can go there and visit. I mean, you're there now, right? You can go and
not
visit,
a problem.
no problem.
I mean, I can go and come 90 days without any hassle at all.
Yeah.
The Singapore passport, I believe, is the most accepted in the world now. It surpassed the German one. Very
nice.
But the other big reason why I did it is having a passport is not always an advantage. You know, when you're a citizen and if you're living abroad, you become painfully aware that you're being taxed on citizenship. And you might be going to Singapore and only pay 7% taxes, but then the US government will come and say, hey, I actually want another 30% from you. So in Europe right now, we are being taxed on residency. So I don't have this problem. But I believe that in the near future, Europe is going to change that policy and basically adopt the same systems that the United States does, which means that European citizens living anywhere abroad are probably going to have to pay taxes back to Europe.
Right.
And the reason why I'm thinking this is, because Europe needs a lot of cash. Countries like Italy have most of their young people leaving. Even Germany has 200,000 Germans leaving every year.
Right.
And these are the people with the high skills and good opportunities. And B, you might be aware of the OECD bank standard, which is being implemented across the world. And with this standard, there will basically be a lot more bank information sharing across just about every country besides the United States and I guess North Korea and Iran. And what that basically means that if you're going to have taxation worldwide based on citizenship, then you have to have a way to implement it. And if every bank has to report back that information to you, then you can implement it. If you don't have that, then it's very difficult to implement it. In the case of the United States, there's FATCA, which basically is equivalent for the U.S. It's mostly one way of information going to the U.S., but that's what's making it possible in practice for the U.S. to tax every U.S. citizen based on income. So with that happening, I can kind of foresee how the German passport in the future might become a bit of a liability when it comes to taxation.
Right.
Because suddenly I might go from my 7% tax rate to 40% or 50% because Germany wants to have 40% of the cut just because I have that passport. So, and it's a lot more difficult to give up citizenship once a system like that is in place.
Right. You said that you were earning 4 times more amount of money. What was the difference between when you were a resident and working in Germany, and then the difference when you changed to Singapore? The specific difference there.
Sure. You have to understand, if you work in Germany, if you're getting $100, for example, as an employee, your employer actually has to pay $97 in various fees. Now, some of that is pension, but I don't really believe in German pension system. Some of that are various taxes, insurances, and so on. So by the time you're done, for you to get 100, your employer has to pay 197. Now, the 100, you don't actually get it in your pocket. Around 48 of that, in my case, had to be withheld by the employer for my tax return, which means I'm only getting 52. Mm-hmm. Now, of these 52, if I'm going to the store to buy something, the sales tax in Germany is about 20%. So I'm being left with around $42 out of $197. And if I put the money in a bank, I'm being charged taxes on interest and there's taxes on capital gains. So by the time I'm done, my tax rate really is at least 80%.
Wow.
When I moved to Singapore, my German employer still paid me the $197. For them, basically nothing changed. But I was no longer an employee in Germany. I was a contractor out of Singapore. So they just paid me the $197. Now, when I told the Singapore government I'm earning my money in Germany on a contract basis, they told me, well, we don't care. We don't need to tax you. So you can see how I went from around having $42 to $45 in my pocket to having $190 in my pocket.
Yeah.
Nothing changed to my employer. I did the same job. Every now and then they will fly me back to Germany to do some give some conferences or some technical training to people. And I quadrupled my income just because I changed jurisdiction.
Amazing. Yeah, so people familiar with the PT theory, flag theory stuff, that sounds like a great option as far as the citizenship flag, if you can get it. It sounds phenomenal, and probably will be in the future very valuable as well. So
it is, but it comes with a cost. I mean, you have to give up your other citizenships.
Right. Yeah.
And, you basically, and it will take a while to get. It's not an easy one to get. But essentially, the more, when you go and you apply for your citizenship or for permanent residency, it's more like a job interview. I mean, they're basically looking, okay, what sort of person do you have? What sort of skills do you have? What do you bring to Singapore? And there are different criteria, but, in my case, if you have a good set of skills, that will get you a passport easily.
Yeah, well, it makes sense. I also had a friend who was attempting to do that, and I think he spent, it had to be more than 5 years, he was telling me, trying to get a citizenship in Singapore, but he wasn't able to do it, and he ended up spending a lot of money trying to do it, renting an apartment there and all kinds of stuff. And at the end, it didn't work, so, it's not the easiest thing, but I would say that it's great if you can get it, so... I would like to, so let's move on to some more about your business here. So we've talked about why Singapore is a great jurisdiction. What is it about your company specifically that is different from other precious metal vault businesses? Well,
when I started the company, I was very much under the influence of my experience of 2008 with Lehman Brothers going bankrupt and seeing, sort of what that can mean. So I built the company specifically to be the most transparent as possible and to make sure that my jurisdictional risk is limited to Singapore. And what I mean with that is I am starting off with the idea that there's going to be a major financial crisis in the world at some point in the future, and that the United States might impose capital controls again, that they might no longer allow you to move money freely in and out, which already is getting harder and harder to move money if you've been trying to wire money out of the US. And I'm assuming that there's a possibility that there might be a nationalization of gold again, which is an obvious sort of choice if there's going to be a currency crisis. So based on these factors, I'm asking myself, if I'm storing my gold in Singapore with an American company, with an American vault operator, what's going to happen? Is that company going to follow US law, or is that company going to follow, let's say, Singapore law? Well, in practice, if you read a storage contract, you will find that there's a force majeure clause, which basically states that the vault operator indemnifies himself against the consequences of complying with any governmental rule by any government anywhere. And what that basically means to me, and then having asked this question many, many times to many different vault operators, to many different people, I pretty much got convinced that if we are going to have a gold nationalization in the United States, then any company or any bank which is closely tied to the U.S., and every bank is closely tied to the U.S. because they have to be able to do U.S. dollar trading, is going to follow U.S. law.
Right.
And what that means is that it's basically pointless for you to move your gold to Singapore if you're storing it with a company which is going to have to follow U.S. law.
Yeah, that's funny. I'm sorry to interrupt you. That's funny, though, because it reminds me, I used to have an account with Gold Money. I no longer do. I'm sure you're familiar with Gold Money. And they were asking, I had to tie an American bank account to my account there. And I did not like that part of the process. That made me uncomfortable. So that kind of, I think, exactly what you're talking about.
Well, one thing you have to realize is that Gold Money will typically, or almost all of the big storage companies, and the small ones as well, they don't store the gold themselves, typically. They will outsource it to a small number of vaulting companies. And these are Brinks. You're probably familiar with Brinks.
Brinks, yeah.
They're with Loomis. Loomis used to be called Viamat in the past. They're very big in Switzerland and so on. And there are a couple of other ones. But the two really big ones, they're international logistic companies, and they store a lot of gold for a lot of companies. It's Loomis and Brinks. Now, Loomis, being Swiss, has felt the wrath of the United States and decided that they no longer want to take U.S. customers as customers. So U.S. Companies, yes. U.S. private citizens, no. Brinks is the other option. So when you're storing with, say, Gold Money, you're most likely ending up actually storing with Brinks. And Brinks will then move the bullion where it needs to go and so on. What makes us different is when we built the company, we realized, that if we were to store with one of these companies like everybody else does, then we are basically no better than everybody else. So we ended up building our own vault. And in Singapore now, there are two large vaults which are considered world class. One is the Singapore Freeport, which has many different vault operators inside. And the other one is the Safe House, which is the vault we built. The Singapore government actually, featured us quite a bit on these things. So we put quite a lot of investment in, and we basically became an integrated solution where we do the storage, we do the buying and the selling, and then now we also have the peer-to-peer. We also do the testing, meaning we have testing labs to make sure that it's authentic and real bullion, which a normal vault operator will not do this because they don't want to have the risk of, or the headaches basically of having to deal with some bullion which might or might not be real. So they're just operating on a set to contain basis. For us, since we're doing everything in-house, we are basically giving you that absolute certainty that we are only Singapore-based, that we are not subject to U.S. laws, we are not subject to European laws, we are not subject to laws from Botswana or Burundi. All of these are foreign jurisdictions for us, and if we get a call from any of these jurisdictions, we basically refer them back to a court in Singapore, and that's normally where the inquiry is going to die, unless it has some sort of criminal component to it, in which case, of course, that's something different. But what I'm basically trying to say is, if there's going to be a gold nationalization in the U.S., it will not affect us. But it might affect a lot of people who might have the gold in Singapore stored at international vaults. And having said all of this, we are now renting storage space to Loomis. So we are actually at our vault renting out storage space now to one of the big vault providers.
Okay, great. And also I wanted to add, you're talking about allocated gold. There's also a lot of people that sell gold, and they're selling unallocated gold, like for instance, the gold card that Peter Schiff sells, Schiff Gold. That's unallocated, and that's actually from the Australian vault there. And so you have a percentage of some large vault of gold. But and then you have allocated, where you have a specific amount, which is like gold money. But you're even farther down that continuum, where you have specific gold with you, and there's no counterparty as far as other people even storing it. So it's all directly with your company. So that's very interesting.
Yes. One important thing about what you just said is people sometimes confuse terms. Allocated typically just means that if you have 100 customers who have 100 ounces of gold with you, you're supposed to have 100 ounces of gold. That's what allocated means. And most people think that's good, that's fine. But there's a big problem with that, because that gold does not belong to a customer. It belongs to the company who's basically selling it to them. So it's really only a liability. Now, the company can use that gold for various purposes. For example, you could take that gold and you could lease it out to somebody else. It's quite common in this industry, and that's why storage fees sometimes are very low, because people earn an income basically lending out a portion of that gold. It's completely legal because it's not owned by the customer. It's just a liability which is being owed to the customer. Another problem is there are plenty of companies out there which take whatever gold is being stored and they use it as inventory for their buying and selling. So imagine a scenario where you're dealing with a company, you're storing 100 ounces of gold, and they're also selling that to other people. It works fine as long as there's not a shortage of gold. But if at some point there's a shortage of gold and you can no longer get more gold, then what might happen is the company might have sold that gold, might have sold that silver, cannot replace it, and suddenly the gold you thought you had stored with that company is gone, because really all you have is a liability. So at Silver Bullion, we don't do allocated, we do segregated ownership. And what I mean with segregated ownership is when you buy bullion from us, you don't buy, say, 100 ounces of gold. What you buy is 10-ounce gold bars. Each one of these gold bars having their own serial number. You get your own photo that is then tracked by that serial number, and it's being audited by PwC, which is one of the big 4 auditing companies worldwide, as well as Bureau Veritas, which is a bullion inspection company. And we do that every quarter. We also test the bullion on a per bar basis. So that if you need to ask us, well, is it real? Well, we can give you the test results using ultrasound, using X-ray spectrography, and using electrical conductivity, as well as density. So we've basically gone all the way not to leave any question open as far as what your legal status is, which is that you're a legal title owner of bullion under Singapore jurisdiction, that the bullion is real, which we do through these testing systems that we have, which can be retrieved online, seeing who did it when and what the results are, and that the bullion has not been allocated to other people. And the way we prove that is that we have a big parcel ownership list where every individual parcel shows next to it the anonymous ID of the owner. And that's made available to all customers, so that it's impossible for us to double assign one parcel to multiple people. And the more you go into the details of the systems, the more you basically realize that there's a lot of funny things happening in this industry. And we basically wanted to create a system which makes it impossible for us to do any of these things. And that's what builds trust. And most of our customers tend to be the sophisticated type of customer who's aware of some of these problems in the industry and is looking for a solution which is basically as clean as possible.
Yeah, no, that sounds great. Sounds like you really thought this through. What I did want to ask you also about is I see on your website that you accept Bitcoin. That's another big topic now, Bitcoin, cryptocurrencies. So what I wanted to ask is, what is the relationship that you see between these, precious metals, Bitcoin, in the coming years? I know you talk a lot about seeing some sort of a crash or something like that in the future. How do you think that precious metals and Bitcoin are going to play against each other in that type of scenario?
I think they can complement each other. I think the typical investor of gold quite a number of them, or proportion of these people, basically want to put some of the assets in something that's outside the financial system. And putting into physical gold or silver, that's a very, very good way of doing that. But putting a little bit of that into a cryptocurrency like Bitcoin, that also makes sense. I mean, it's a similar setup. You have, in some ways, a bit more risk if you go into Bitcoin, but right now, it's going up like crazy. So you have a lot of volatilities there. The good thing about Bitcoin is you can transfer it easily, so it's very liquid. But I would say the problem is that if governments ever wanted to crack down on it and say Bitcoin is no longer legal or cannot be accepted by a business, then the value of it will crash very quickly. So that's one of the issues. Now, having said that, I do believe that cryptocurrencies are the way of the future. Ideally, what I would like to see is them to replace the banking system as a whole. Right now, the way I see it, banks are having 4 functions. One of it is a store of value, a way of doing loans, a way of transferring funds, and an authority. What I mean with authority is if I have some auditors coming, they will always start with a bank statement and then go back from there in order to do your audit. So I would argue that having a blockchain should be a much better authority, let's say, than a bank.
Sure.
Transferring money, well, a cryptocurrency, can probably do that better than a bank can, because if you've been doing wire transfers lately, it's such a hassle and so many issues with that. When it comes to make loans, we created a peer-to-peer system where people can lend and borrow amongst each other. So we don't really need to have a bank. We can take the bank out from that. And if it comes to a store of value, well, I mean, you can store your value in gold or silver, cryptocurrencies and other things. You can store it in cash. You don't necessarily need to put it, have a bank. So I believe that's a combination of having gold and silver as a fallback, something that's universally accepted anywhere in the world. I mean, you can go to Vietnam and gold will be accepted. You can go to India and will be accepted. You can go to Germany. In Germany, you can actually take a silver coin and go to a money exchanger and he'll give you euros for it. So having such flexibility and such universal acceptance of gold and silver, that's very valuable. And that's something that cryptocurrencies don't really have nowadays as much. So putting these two things together, I think it's a way for eventually replacing banks themselves. So I hope and I expect things to be going better and better in that direction. That doesn't mean that Bitcoin is going to be, going up forever, going to be that currencies. In some ways, I think Bitcoin might be a proof of concept, and we might be having some other cryptocurrency, a follow-up cryptocurrency, which probably will establish itself due to some technical limitations that we'll probably end up having with Bitcoin.
Yeah, I agree with everything you just said. By the way, I know you're involved with the banking system there and all that. Have you seen any the government or any of the banks any interest in getting involved in cryptocurrencies, incorporating it into their business models?
I think what you have to realize is I've worked as a senior data architect for a major bank, so I've got to see for 3 years, what's the mentality and the modus operandi of a bank is. And banks are extremely conservative. I mean, you look at the bank I was working on, they had 2,700 different IT systems. And the reason they had so many IT systems is because they were too scared to change an old IT system. And they just kept on putting new stuff on top of new stuff. And it's incredibly inefficient. They're very resistant to really change. And the people who end up working for banks in IT nowadays don't tend to be the people who are really wanting to change things. So I don't expect the financial system to really embrace cryptocurrencies. I think it has to be new companies or companies like Google or Apple, which are already IT companies, which are going to increasingly, lead the change towards cryptocurrencies. Right. So I think the existing financial system is going to be the big loser of it, because in many ways they are so inefficient in so many ways.
Right. It's kind of a cultural problem within the finance industry.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, having said that, my understanding is that there's quite a bit of support for cryptocurrencies at the central bank level. So I've heard a little bit that the Bundesbank, the German central bank, the Bank of England, to some degree the Fed, they're actually quite positive, or they're quite encouraged by cryptocurrencies. Of course, they would want to have some sort of system which can be controlled to some degree and follows jurisdictional and taxation laws and so on. But they are not necessarily impressed by banks nowadays, because banks have been creating a lot of problems to central banks. So I see from a governmental side, there's actually some support for it. And there are some countries such as Georgia, which has been doing a lot, in that direction.
That's very interesting. So let's move on to your innovative P2P platform. Talk a little bit about that. So obviously we talked about being able to store your gold, and specifically silver, right? I think you guys do a lot more silver than gold. I mean, it's called silver bullion, so I would assume so. Is that right?
Yeah, when I started Silver Bullion, we were the only ones who were selling silver in Singapore.
Okay.
And personally, I like silver a lot, because I think it's quite undervalued compared to gold. But by value, it's about 50-50.
Okay.
So 50% of what we sell is gold, 50% is silver. Mm-hmm. It's just that when you have to store it, silver takes almost 100 times more space than gold.
Yeah.
So most of our storage facility is for silver.
Okay. Yeah. So now, not only that, but now with your company, people can borrow money with no credit check or all that type of regular paperwork that goes into it, not needing to go to a bank. They can borrow against their precious metals holdings from another customer of your institution. It's direct loans. And what I was surprised is to see the interest rate of the loans that people are getting. So, yeah, if you don't mind, just telling us a little bit about that program.
Yeah. Well, basically, it started with a customer saying that he needs a loan. He doesn't want to sell his gold, but he needs cash. Can he have a loan? And that was about 3 years ago. And the answer was no, because we don't have a money lending license, and it's very complicated to get it through a bank. But it sort of got me thinking of how can I say yes to that question? And I spent about 8 months dealing with banks and lawyers, trying to figure out the best way of making it work. And then I suddenly realized that Singapore right now actually has a very favorable jurisdiction and legal environment towards fintech, financial technology. And we were actually able to create a peer-to-peer lending, which means that one customer lends directly to another customer, and we are just an intermediary. I often like to describe it a little bit like eBay. You have sellers and you have buyers, and eBay is sort of the escrow in between. Now, in our case, the customer who wants to borrow, he would have to have gold stored with us. Say the person has $100,000 worth of gold, and he wants to borrow $50,000. He can only borrow 50% of the value of the gold at the point in time when he wants to borrow. That person would then go online and say, okay, I want to borrow $50,000, and he can specify what interest rate he wants to pay and the duration. So he might say, I need it for 1 year, I'm willing to pay 3%. And a lender might then come and say, well, I have $50,000, I want 4% for a year. So the lender will put in, say, this is basically a bid and ask system. So you would make a lending offer for 4%. The borrower would have a borrowing request for 3%. So maybe the borrower would say, okay, I'll go for 3.5%. The lender might say, okay, 3.5% is okay. A contract is made, and the money is transferred. Now, the money actually is at Silver Bullion. So for a lender to make an offer, he would already have transferred the money to us. It goes into an escrow account where it's basically being held in his name. And when the contract is made, then at the next loan start date, which is 4 times per month, it's on the 1st, the 8th, the 15th, and the 22nd, the money will then go to the borrower. After 1 year, the money will be coming back with the interest. If the money does not come back because the borrower cannot return the funds for some reason, then the borrower could actually do a loan with somebody else and just do a rollover. But say for whatever reason there's a default, then we will just be selling the bullion, make sure that the lender gets the principal and the interest, and whatever's remaining will still be in the name of the borrower. So the 200% collateral basically makes it extremely safe for the lender. Now, because it's so safe, the lender is willing to take a relatively low interest rate. What we're seeing right now is on 1 month's loan, which are extremely short, you're looking at maybe, say, 2% per year. So you're paying 0.15% for a month, almost nothing basically. On a 1 year loan, we're looking around 4%, 3 to 4%. 6 year loans, we are seeing people wanting to have 5-6%. And that tends to be because people holding US dollars, at least our customers, they don't want to commit on lending out the money for that long unless they have a higher interest rate, because they feel something might happen in 2 years and I might want to move some of that money into bullion. So that's the yield curve we are seeing. But we basically made our own exchange for this and letting people do their own bidding and ask. And on all of this, we when interest is paid, we earn 0.5%. And that's the only fee. So on the borrower and then on the lender side. So if a lender, for example, is lending out at 4%, when the interest is paid, 3.5% goes to the lender, 0.5% goes to us.
Is that what the interest rates are now, about 3%?
Yes, about 3 to 4% for 1 year loan.
Yeah, so
we had some
low. Yeah.
We had some customers who raised $1.2 million in 3 days.
Wow.
So they basically ended up getting the 3% lenders and then the 4% and the 4.5%. And he raised the average interest rate from 3 to around 4.5 by taking $1.5 million or $1.2 million dollars. And then he took that money and bought Bitcoin. And so I guess that was when Bitcoin was still around 900. So that was a very good deal.
Right. And so I assume he had, like $1 million in precious metals there to be able to do that, right?
He had $2.5 million
okay.
in precious metals.
Right.
Since we started the system about 1.5 years ago, we had around over 1,200 contracts made. We have around 350 participants. And we had a volume of around, in US dollar terms, around $23 million.
Wow.
So every day we're having 2 or 3 loans being made. So it's working very well, actually.
Great. So another thing I wanted to ask you about, which I think people will be interested in, is on your website, it says that the client information is not on the internet, I believe. I'm trying to remember how it was worded. What does that mean? How do you secure the personal information of your clients?
Well, essentially, we have 2 ways of storing bullion. One of the ways is for you to buy the bullion with silver bullion and for silver bullion to store it for you. Now, if you do that, you are using an online interface and you're able to buy and sell your bullion online, use the P2P loans and so on. So your data is online. But we have a second way for you to store bullion, which is to buy the bullion through Silver Bullion or anybody else and storing it at the safe house, at our storage facility, in a safe deposit box. Now, that's basically the high privacy way of doing it. If you take that bullion, you put it inside a box, then it's being locked. That information is only at the safe house, only at our vault facility, and that system is offline. It doesn't need to be online, basically. So that gives a high level of privacy. And another advantage for U.S. Customers is that the IRS is pretty specific in saying that a safe deposit box is not a financial account. So it is my understanding that a U.S. citizen would not have to report gold that he's putting in a safe deposit box And for us, it's basically just a storage contract for a box. So that's a way of storing Bullion which is inflexible, because we can put the Bullion inside the box for you when you start the box. But if you want to later access it, you will actually have to either fly to Singapore, or you have an authorized representative in Singapore physically access that box and taking things out. And so if you put in a safe deposit box, basically your data is offline. So that's what that refers to.
Okay, great. Sounds like a lot of great things that you're doing there, and things that certainly people in this audience are going to enjoy taking a look at. Again, you can go to silverbullion.com.sg. Remember that SG at the end. Thank you very much for coming on the podcast, and I hope to keep in touch.
Definitely. Come to Singapore sometimes. We'll show you
I'd
the
love
world.
to. Okay, thank you.
Take care.
All right, so I hope everybody enjoyed that podcast. Please go to borderlessblog.com if you want to see the notes and things like that for this episode. Also, I don't have any sponsor or affiliate for this episode, so if you would like to donate, that would be greatly appreciated. Thanks again, and please subscribe so you can get the next podcast.
Thanks for joining us for the Borderless Podcast, traveling, investing, and living beyond borders.